We did not ask for permission to be free. We stood up and claimed it. Addis Ababa, the African Union Summit. On paper, it was just another official gathering. Flags neatly arranged, delegations seated in rows, translators adjusting their headsets. But beneath the surface, everyone knew this summit was different. For the first time, Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, was expected to address the hall in his own words. Not scripted by advisors, not filtered by Western media, but straight from the podium of Africa's highest stage. To many Africans watching, this was hope. To others, especially those who feared the rise of an independent, sovereign Africa, this was danger. Because Traoré's voice carried more than speeches. It carried defiance against neocolonialism, against external interference, and against the quiet deals that had long kept Africa divided. And that is why, just minutes before he was due to step onto the stage, someone was prepared to silence him. At 6:47 p.m., a service door on the lower level was found stuck half open. Nothing unusual at first glance. Workers came and went all the time, but a steel trolley rolled through, its wheels leaving faint wet tracks across the polished tiles. Two men in catering whites pushed it forward, their expressions blank, their pace steady. They looked like part of the staff, but their names weren't on the roster. That mattered, because every staff badge had been checked, double-checked, and logged hours earlier. And yet, here were two men walking calmly through a service hallway with no clearance, no verification, and a route that overlapped with the one path that mattered most: the short corridor connecting the holding room to the podium. Security professionals call it the kill zone. A leader has to walk through it no matter what. Short, narrow, and predictable. If you wanted a clean shot, close range, with maximum effect and minimum noise, that corridor was the place. On the mezzanine above, a Burkina Faso captain had his eyes glued to a small tablet screen. He wasn't watching the flags, or the stage, or the audience. He was watching the cameras, every feed, every angle, every flicker of movement. And in the lower left corner of his display, one feed told him everything he needed to know. There was a blind spot, just 4 seconds long. No more, no less. A camera glitch that had been noted weeks earlier and scheduled for repair after the summit. 4 seconds doesn't sound like much, but in the world of close protection, 4 seconds is forever. In 4 seconds, a suppressed rifle could be raised, fired twice, and hidden again. In 4 seconds, a nation's voice could be cut short, and chaos could replace order. That blind spot had already appeared in intelligence once before. Weeks earlier, Ethiopian security intercepted a notebook on the Djibouti docks. Inside was a crude drawing of the summit layout. A red square marked the exact same blind spot. At the time, no one knew whether it was idle scribbling or a genuine threat. But now, as the captain watched the trolley roll straight toward that very spot, the pieces snapped together. The lids of the trolley didn't sit flat. The men's gloves were too thick for catering work, and one of them kept brushing his wrist as though adjusting something beneath the sleeve. The captain had seen this before. Encrypted radios. Timing was everything. The plan wasn't to fire randomly, it was to wait for the perfect cue. The moment before the national anthem, when the house lights dim, the flags light up, and every head in the audience turns away from the stage for just a second. That's when the suppressed rifles would rise, inside the blind spot, and history would be rewritten in silence. If they moved too early, the plan would fail. If they moved too late, the opportunity would vanish. But inside that narrow corridor, with 4 seconds of invisibility, the job could be done. And in that instant, one man's calm voice over the radio could decide whether a continent kept its voice or lost it before it ever spoke. The blind spot was seconds away. The men pushed the steel trolley forward, every step measured, every movement disguised as routine. To the untrained eye, they looked like caterers. To the trained eye of the Burkina Faso captain above, they looked like executioners waiting for their cue. On his radio, he whispered one word: watch. Two plainclothes guards positioned near the corridor shifted slightly. They didn't draw attention, didn't block the men outright. Instead, they slowed the flow of movement, forcing the suspects to linger just a moment longer under the cameras. One of the men adjusted his sleeve again. The signal was undeniable now. There was tech strapped under there, and it wasn't a kitchen timer. The trolley hit the start of the blind spot. 4 seconds. The captain gave the order. Move! It happened fast, too fast for anyone in the corridor to process. One guard dropped low, kicking the wheel of the trolley to jam it sideways. Another yanked the lid free, exposing what lay hidden. 2 compact rifles, suppressors already attached, magazines taped together for quick reload. The men in white lunged. They weren't amateurs. One went for his wrist device, thumbing a code into the glove. The other tried to reach inside his coat, where a slim blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights. But they were already too late. Within a second, they were slammed against the wall, arms twisted back, weapons stripped away. One guard pressed a boot down on the radio device, crushing it before the code could transmit. Another sealed the weapons into a thermal bag. Evidence, not tools of death. The entire scuffle lasted less than 7 seconds. Not a single shot fired. Not a single scream heard inside the main hall. To the delegates waiting for the speech, nothing seemed out of place. The music rehearsal continued. The chatter of translation headsets buzzed softly. But in that narrow service corridor, history had just pivoted. The captain replayed the camera feed, his finger tracing the red square of the blind spot. 4 seconds had been the window. And in those 4 seconds, a continent could have lost its most defiant voice. The arrested men were dragged into a secured chamber beneath the venue. Their catering whites were torn off, revealing armored vests beneath. Their gloves carried not only radios, but biometric sensors, designed to transmit live confirmation of the kill to someone outside the building. But who? That question would haunt the investigation. Because these men were not locals. Their IDs were fake. Their accents slipped under pressure, revealing training from far beyond Ethiopian soil. The rifles bore serial numbers sanded off, but forensic dusting revealed something chilling: the faint imprint of a private shipping company, a company whose routes crossed through Djibouti, Haifa, and Marseille. By the time the hall erupted in applause for Traoré's arrival, the plotters were already gagged, cuffed, and on their way to interrogation. Yet the bigger story had only just begun. Because stopping the shooters was the easy part. Finding out who sent them and why Netanyahu's name kept surfacing in the intercepted chatter, that was the storm waiting just beyond the summit walls. The corridor was secure. The men were under arrest. But the real battle was just beginning. Inside the secured chamber, the trolley lay dismantled on a steel table. Every component was tagged, every item photographed. What looked like kitchen equipment had been refitted into precision concealment. Hollow trays, false panels, even the handles were detachable, designed to disguise weapons until the very last second. The rifles told their own story: compact, suppressed, professional. Not the kind used by local militias, and not the type you find on a black market stall. These had been custom-built. The serial numbers were scraped off with acid, but under ultraviolet light, faint traces of laser etching remained. The imprint was partial, but enough for a match, a European contractor whose exports moved through Djibouti's freight docks. That discovery changed everything. Because weeks earlier, Ethiopian customs officers had intercepted a suspicious shipment manifest. Crates labeled as medical refrigeration units, routed from the same contractor, but with inconsistencies in weight and handling codes. The seized crate contained no refrigeration coils. Instead, it held hollow compartments lined with lead foil, the kind used to fool scanners. At the time, it was written off as smuggling. But placed next to the rifles in Addis Ababa, the pattern became undeniable. Someone had built a shadow supply chain, using legitimate freight routes to funnel weapons into Africa under the cover of ordinary trade. The interrogations of the captured men gave little away. They were trained, disciplined, and heavily medicated with blockers that dulled memory recall. Their forged IDs pointed to non-existent companies. Their accents carried hints of Levantine drill instruction. Not local, not European, but something in between. Then came the encrypted gloves. Forensic teams cracked the devices, expecting voice relays. What they found was stranger. A pulse-based code designed to confirm one thing only: kill verification. Each glove could transmit biometric proof of a target's death. In other words, these men were not assassins freelancing for profit. They were operators delivering proof of contract to a client who demanded confirmation before payment. But who was the client? When investigators traced the freight records back through Djibouti, they hit a wall. Officials denied any irregular shipments. Statements were polished, uniform, and too quick to dismiss. Yet port logs told a different story. Containers had been rerouted under emergency exemptions, bypassing scans. The exemptions were signed by intermediaries tied not to governments, but to private security firms operating out of Haifa and Marseille. The Burkina captain stared at the files in silence. For him, the threat was no longer abstract. It wasn't just about Traoré, or Burkina Faso, or even Ethiopia. This was about Africa's future being manipulated through shadow networks, logistics companies, contractors, and cutouts designed to leave no fingerprints. And yet, a single name kept echoing through the chatter. Not written in the freight logs, not signed on the exemptions, but whispered in intercepted calls, muttered in half-broken Arabic, and denied with suspicious urgency whenever questioned. Netanyahu. His name was not evidence, not yet, but it was enough to terrify those listening. Because if an Israeli-linked network was funneling weapons into Africa under diplomatic covers, then the story was far bigger than one assassination attempt. It meant external powers were playing a double game, smiling in summits, while their proxies moved rifles in crates labeled as medicine. The evidence trail was fragile, incomplete, and deliberately obscured, but it pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Traoré's survival was not an accident. It was a direct blow to an operation that expected him dead before he could speak. And now, with the shooters captured and the freight routes exposed, the African leaders faced a choice: bury the story to avoid panic, or bring it into the open and risk a confrontation with forces far more powerful than any single nation in the room. For Traoré, the decision was clear. He would not hide. He would step onto the stage, not as a survivor of an assassination plot, but as the voice of a continent ready to confront the shadow war against it. The applause echoed through the main hall of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. Delegates were smiling, unaware of how close they had come to disaster. Only a handful of security officers and a Burkina captain knew the truth. Rifles had been less than 10 meters away from Ibrahim Traoré. Behind closed doors, the debate began. Ethiopian officials wanted silence. They feared chaos if news of the attempted assassination spread too fast. One minister argued, "The summit must continue. If we admit danger, we admit weakness." But others disagreed. A Ghanaian delegate slammed his fist on the table. Weakness is hiding facts. We cannot build trust if our leaders are being hunted in the corridors. Traoré himself sat quietly, hands folded, eyes steady. He was not a man rattled by the brush with death. In fact, he looked sharper, calmer, as if survival had only confirmed his mission. Finally, the chair called order. Reports from security were read aloud. 2 men in catering whites, suppressed rifles, encrypted radios, a notebook with a red square marking the camera blind spot. The evidence was real. The plot, undeniable. A murmur swept the room. Every delegation suddenly realized the same thing. If Traoré could be targeted in Addis Ababa, then none of them were safe in their own capitals. The tension could have broken the summit. Some leaders wanted to leave immediately, to return home before the story exploded. But Traoré raised his hand. The hall fell silent. He spoke slowly, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "Brothers, sisters, this is not only an attack on me. This is an attack on Africa's voice. If we run, we reward those who planned this. If we divide, we make their work easy. But if we stand together, today, now, then the message will be clear. No one silences us. The words cut through the anxiety like steel. Instead of fear, the hall began to hum with determination. One by one, delegations shifted their stance. The Nigerian envoy leaned forward. If they tried this today, they can try it tomorrow. We need structure, not speeches, Kenya's representative added. We can investigate together. Chain of custody, neutral observers. A joint review, South Africa's minister said bluntly. We must treat an attack on one leader as an attack on all. For the first time in years, Africa's leaders weren't trading slogans. They were trading standards. Security staff projected a draft protocol onto the screen. It was short, precise, and radical. Mutual defense window. If any head of state is attacked, all partners respond within hours, not weeks. Evidence integrity. All seized weapons logged with dual signatures, neutral observers, and mirrored vault storage. Rapid response teams. Shared drills, shared radios, and civilian first engagement rules. Transparency. Scheduled briefings, one spokesperson per incident, and a rumor control bulletin published within 24 hours. Traoré listened, nodded, then stood. He called it the African Security Alliance. Not a treaty of words, but a practical shield. We will not point fingers today. We will not chase shadows. We will build a lock the whole world can see. Africa will not kneel, and Africa will not hide. The hall erupted in applause. This time, the applause was not ceremony. It was survival transformed into unity. Outside, journalists sensed the shift. Instead of whispers of chaos, they began to report a different story. Assassination attempt blocked. Summit holds firm. Leaders draft new security alliance. For the first time, the narrative was not about panic. It was about discipline. And in that discipline lay something far more dangerous to Africa's enemies than any bullet, a continent refusing to be fractured. By the time the African delegations voted to move forward, the news had already leaked. First, a single line appeared on local Addis Ababa outlets. Heightened security at AU summit. Minutes later, international wires pushed the word everyone had avoided. Assassination. Photos spread of a taped-off service corridor. Headlines clashed. Security incident in Addis Ababa. Burkina Faso's Traoré narrowly escapes plot. Summit continues under heavy guard. But even before most journalists opened their laptops, something unusual happened. A press office overseas issued a denial. No link, no knowledge, no involvement. The denial was faster than the investigation, faster than the evidence log, faster than the questions themselves. And that speed told its own story. Because inside the sealed evidence bags were not just rifles and radios. There was also a freight stub, a small piece of paper, folded and sweat-stained, but crucial. The stub claimed to be for refrigeration units, but the weight was wrong. The consignee's name was misspelled. The insurance writer used language reserved for precision assemblies, not medical coolers. Even worse, a tiny barcode taped inside a pocket notebook matched a larger manifest from Djibouti, a manifest rooted under a humanitarian label. Reporters with access began calling freight managers, insurance brokers, and retired customs officers. Their verdict was unanimous. This was no typo. This was a pattern. The rifle's etched codes lined up with the disputed shipment. The humanitarian containers had been repacked and slipped into a larger military consignment. On paper, they looked clean. In practice, they carried death. And yet, when the questions reached Western capitals, the answers were thin and rehearsed. No involvement. Fabricated. False. Not a single audit was offered. Not a single alternative explanation. Just blanket denial. For African leaders in Addis Ababa, this was confirmation of their deepest suspicion. The world did not want clarity. The world wanted silence. But clarity was exactly what Traoré demanded. He told the hall, "We are not here to trade rumor for revenge. We are here to protect the podium, protect the evidence, and protect our people. If someone tried to erase our voice, then our answer is not panic. Our answer is process." Meanwhile, in Western media, the narrative split sharply. Some outlets downplayed it as a minor disruption. Others amplified it as proof of chaos in African summits. Few dared to ask the obvious question: who armed the men, and why did the denial come so fast? Independent analysts, however, connected the dots. On evening shows, they displayed a simple map. Freight origin, Djibouti port broker, Marseille consignment, Addis Ababa summit city, 3 red arrows. One conclusion: someone with access, somewhere along that chain, had tried to erase Ibrahim Traoré before his speech. And when the name Netanyahu surfaced in whispers, the fear multiplied. Israel's government dismissed it instantly, calling it slander, propaganda, fabrication. But the very urgency of the dismissal felt suspicious. Why deny so quickly? Why not wait for the evidence review? The answer, some analysts suggested, was simple. Because the freight trail pointed not to a government directly, but to a private security intermediary. A shadow firm renting spectrum, running shell companies, and hiding lethal kits inside legitimate consignments. Technically, denials could be true. Politically, they were empty. The West wanted the story buried. But in Addis Ababa, the leaders had already chosen a different path, to publish the process, line by line, so the world could see what was seized, when it was logged, and how it was audited. For once, Africa would not be the stage of someone else's rumor. It would be the author of its own record.
The summit chamber was heavy with tension. On the walls, national flags stood like silent witnesses. On the table, folders held the evidence: rifles, radios, freight papers, barcodes. Some leaders wanted to shout names, others wanted to go home. But Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward, calm and steady. His words were not loud, but every syllable carried weight. This was not just an attack on Burkina Faso. This was an attack on Africa's dignity. They did not want my words, they wanted our silence. But we will not answer with rumor. We will not answer with revenge. We will answer with standards. The hall grew still. Traoré raised a simple proposal, written not as a speech but as a blueprint. He called it the African Security Alliance, ASA. The room leaned closer. ASA was not theory. It was a system. Practical, urgent, and impossible to ignore. The 5 pillars of ASA: mutual defense window. If any African head of state is targeted, all partner states respond within hours, not weeks. 24 hours, site locked. 72 hours, joint forensic support. 30 days, public report. Evidence integrity. Dual signatures on all chain of custody forms. Hashed digital copies stored in mirrored vaults. No off-the-record edits. No hidden files. Rapid Response Command. A rotating command center with shared radios, joint drills, and civilian-first rules of engagement. Teams trained not just for bullets but for truth. Securing sites, logging serials, and presenting facts the world cannot deny. Logistics and funding. A pooled sovereignty fund for emergencies. 3 regional hubs for training and surge equipment. Shared maintenance lists. No more paper armies. Law and transparency. Standard forms, scheduled briefings, 1 spokesperson per incident. A public rumor control page posting what is known, what is not, and what is under review. Traoré's voice was calm, almost spare. We will not point fingers today. We will build a lock the whole world can see. We will make it expensive to lie and impossible to hide. Some in the room hesitated. Who would fund it? Who would own the data? Could smaller states afford the drills? But the answers were practical. Cost sharing, legal cover, opt-in modules, neutral observers at audits but not in command. One by one, the hesitation broke. A Sahel nation offered drones to monitor freight corridors. A coastal state pledged a training base for evidence handlers. A central hub volunteered to host the first fusion cell. The hall that had nearly fractured now began to move with purpose. Not slogans, not applause. Commitments. Pens touched paper. Hands rose in agreement. By the time the chair called for a show of hands, the majority were already in the air. The symbols shift. Outside, the summit's decision was clear. No cover-ups, no hidden files. The first test of ASA came just hours after its birth. At dawn, in a sealed room at the AU compound, the evidence audit began. Cameras fixed on the door. Neutral observers from 3 countries logged every step. Gloves on, pens steady, body cams recording. One by one, the seized items were laid out. 2 suppressed rifles, tagged and sealed. Polymer magazines wrapped in felt. 3 encrypted handsets, a pocket notebook with the red blind spot square, a freight stub, folded and sweat-marked. Every serial number was read aloud, every photo snapped under ultraviolet light, every timestamp written down to the second. At first, it looked like routine procedure, but then a technician cross-checked the boot splash on one of the seized radios. On screen, in faint code, a phrase appeared. Falcon's Feast. That wasn't a random signal. It was a network tag used by a private security intermediary that had operated across Africa under different shell names. This was not a government signature. It was the mark of contractors for hire, selling deniable operations to the highest bidder. The freight stub confirmed it. The barcode fragment matched a pallet that had traveled with a military shipment routed through Djibouti. That shipment, weeks earlier, had been loudly denied by Israel when suspicions first surfaced. But the audit uncovered the twist. The denial could technically be true, because Israel had not shipped weapons directly. Instead, a private intermediary had piggybacked on the legitimacy of Israel-linked freight, laundering its own lethal kits inside the same consignment. It was a Trojan horse, a parasite operation, and it meant that someone inside Africa with access to permits and customs stamps had opened the door. The evidence trail deepened. The disputed stopover in the cargo logs lined up with the intermediary's known air cargo partners. The insurance rider on the fake refrigeration stub had language recycled from 3 earlier extraction jobs the firm had billed under Site Safety Logistics. None of those jobs had anything to do with hospitals. They were covert paramilitary contracts. The conclusion was brutal but clear. The men who pushed the trolley in Addis were not lone assassins. They were part of a supply chain built by a private firm that thrived in the shadows, using humanitarian covers, military shipments, and local gatekeepers to move weapons across borders unseen. And that changed the politics overnight. Instead of one foreign capital taking the blame, the evidence pointed to a regional access problem. Permits, pallets, people willing to sell silence. For African leaders, this was both a threat and an opportunity. If blame fell only on Israel or the West, lawyers could block the story for years.
The political flip. By evening, the audit findings were summarized in plain language. Rifles seized. Radios traced to Falcon's Feast, a private contractor. Freight stub fraudulent. Containers piggybacked on legitimate military shipments. Local access exploited. No finger-pointing, no wild accusations, just documented fact. The reaction stunned observers. Instead of descending into accusations, delegations asked only one question. How fast can ASA make this impossible next time? In one day, the assassination attempt had been flipped on its head. The attackers wanted to silence Traoré before he spoke. Instead, they had given him the strongest mandate of his life, a united continent demanding standards, evidence, and process. The shadow named still. The whispers would not stop. Analysts on late-night broadcasts asked the question openly: who benefits if Traoré never speaks? Whose strategy relies on silencing Africa's push for sovereignty? The name Netanyahu surfaced again, not in evidence bags but in patterns. His government had long relied on private security intermediaries, contracting them for logistics, training, and counter-terror operations. These were the same shells now exposed in Africa. Official denials were instant and categorical. False, fabricated, propaganda. But the more the denials came, the more they rang hollow. Because while officials dismissed, the evidence was on the table in Addis Ababa, filmed, time-stamped, audited in front of neutral eyes. And that contrast terrified the West. Not because of one assassination attempt, but because Africa was showing the world a discipline it rarely showed. Facts before fury, records before rumors. The West had always painted Africa as chaotic. Now, Africa was exposing the chaos of shadow networks run from abroad. And that narrative was harder to deny than any rifle. The summit chamber was quiet, not with hesitation, but with weight. One by one, delegations studied the draft charter lying before them. The paper was not poetry. It was process. Dates, deadlines, dual signatures, audit doors with cameras, standards that could not be edited in secret. Then came the moment. The chair lifted his pen and placed the first signature. After him, a coastal state leaned forward, then a Sahelian republic, then another, until ink touched every page in the circle. No speeches, no slogans, only signatures. Outside the hall, aides carried the signed charter to a press room. A single camera broadcast the audit calendar on a large screen. 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Every citizen could see the schedule. Every skeptic could mark their calendar. Markets blinked. Commentators gasped. The surprise was not an accusation. It was discipline. Africa had answered not with anger, but with standards the whole world could measure. In capitals abroad, the reaction split. Some dismissed it as symbolic. Others realized the cost. A continent that refused to be divided now had a clock and a charter. Denial was no longer enough. Delay was no longer safe. On the streets of Addis Ababa, students cheered at the word audit. In Ouagadougou, shopkeepers tuned radios low and steady, nodding as the announcer read the dates. Across the diaspora, one phrase lit up posters and timelines. Protect the podium. Protect the proof. The verdict of the continent was not thunder or fire. It was ink on paper, time on the clock, and a new standard written in full view of the world. The ink was barely dry when the chair turned to Ibrahim Traoré. The hall waited, not for applause, but for direction. He did not stand tall to perform. He stood steady to speak. "We have signed our names," he began, "not for show, but for standards. This is not the victory of one leader or one state. It is the mandate of a continent." His voice was calm, almost spare. No slogans, no theatrics, only clarity. When they tried to silence one voice, they underestimated the many. When they tried to strike one moment, they built a movement. This charter is our answer. Proof before blame. Process before noise. A shield you can see. The cameras pulled wide. Around him, the delegations did not smile. They nodded, firm, deliberate, disciplined. In capitals abroad, analysts marked the tone. This was not defiance for its own sake. This was responsibility broadcast live. Traoré lifted the document once, then set it back down. "We did not ask for permission to be free," he said. "We stood up to win it. And now we will guard it, with standards, with evidence, with unity no denial can erase." The hall did not erupt. It held steady, the way grown nations do when the decision is already made. Outside, students painted new signs. Farmers tuned radios and whispered, "This is how Africa speaks when it grows up." The assassins had failed. The brokers had been exposed. But more than that, the continent had turned an attack into a system, a silence into a standard. This was the verdict of the people. This was the mandate of Africa.